With Joseph Persico. He's the author of Roosevelt's Secret War, a book about President Roosevelt and World War II espionage. He spoke at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire earlier this week, and he took questions from the students. This event is just over an hour.
Good afternoon. My name is Barry Scher, and I'm the provost at Dartmouth College. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the fourth of 6 lectures in the Montgomery Endowment series entitled Intelligence, the Need to Know. This series is designed to bring an array of experts to the Dartmouth community to examine intelligence issues which were brought to the nation's keen attention by the tragic events of September 11th. The lectures will continue to be offered each Tuesday here in Filene Auditorium through September 26th, and as always, it'll be at 4 p.m. This series is made possible through the generosity of Kenneth Montgomery, class of 1925, and his wife, Harl, who created and funded the endowment in 1978 so that Dartmouth could bring outstanding individuals to campus to meet with our students and faculty. And as I've done at least once before on this occasion, I'd like to again thank Barbara Gersten, who's done so much to arrange not only this lecture and the entire series, but other events throughout the history of the Montgomery Endowment. We have heard from Mark Gerecht, former officer in the CIA, James Woolsey, former director of Central Intelligence, and David Weiss, author of Bureau and the Mole, which gave us insights into the workings and a major blunder by the FBI. Today's speaker is Joseph Persico, who will give us a more historical view of the United States intelligence activities. In 1956, he began his political writing career, serving Governor Averell Harriman of New York as a writer and researcher, after which he served as a Foreign Service officer for the U.S. Information Agency. By 1966, he became the chief speechwriter for New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Continuing this position for another 7 years, he remained Rockefeller's primary speechwriter as the governor assumed the office of the Vice Presidency of the United States from 1975 to 1977. In 1977, Joseph Persico transitioned into a full-time author, focusing on historical subjects. He wrote on the Civil War in a book entitled My Enemy, My Brother, Men and Days of Gettysburg, and followed that with a novel, The Spiderweb, and a nonfiction study, Piercing the Reich, the penetration of Nazi Germany by American secret agents during World War II. In 1982, Persico focused on Nelson Rockefeller's life and published the biography, The Imperial Rockefeller. During the 90s, the author created other historical works on both American espionage and the Nuremberg war crimes trials following World War II. These works included Casey from the OSS to the CIA and Nuremberg, Infamy on Trial. Persico also chose renowned broadcast journalist Edward R. Murrow for a biographical sketch in 1990. He has collaborated with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of State Colin L. Powell on the latter's biography. Last year, Random House Incorporated released Roosevelt's Secret War, FDR and World War II Espionage, which is the title of his talk today. In his book, Mr. Persico wrote, "Few leaders have been better suited by nature and temperament for the anomalies of secret war than FDR." And to quote FDR, "You know I am a juggler and I never let my right hand know what my left hand does," he once confessed. "I may be entirely inconsistent, and furthermore, I am perfectly willing to mislead and tell untruths if it will help me win this war." Mr. Persico goes on to comment that Roosevelt's style of leadership bears out this admission. His behavior, which fascinated, puzzled, amazed, dismayed, and occasionally repelled people, parallels many of the qualities of an espionage chief. Let us now hear more about Roosevelt, the man who created America's first intelligence agency, the SOS, by welcoming Joseph Persico.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Dr. Scher. Dr. Scher mentioned that I spent part of my checkered past writing speeches for Nelson Rockefeller, who was a Dartmouth alum, class of 1930. My most vivid recollection of his years here was from the very beginning. He arrived here as an 18-year-old in 1926. And the first thing he did was call upon Dr. Hopkins, so that before ever having met a fellow classmate, a fellow roommate, a faculty advisor, he had tea with the president of the college, which I consider probably one of the pioneer programs in America of the Head Start program. Ever since my book, Roosevelt's Secret War, was published last fall, I've been asked repeatedly about the parallels between December 7th, 1941 and September 11th, 2001. My general observation is that while techniques and technologies change, the historical forces remain surprisingly similar, and our reactions to these forces, which I think will be borne out by some of my remarks today. In September of 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented fourth term against the Republican candidate Thomas E. Dewey, then governor of New York State. The chief of staff of the Army at that time was General George Marshall. Marshall was very concerned to learn that Dewey intended to raise as a political issue the attack on Pearl Harbor. Dewey's reasoning was as follows. Everybody knew that the United States was breaking the Japanese diplomatic code through a code-breaking operation known as Magic. Therefore, Roosevelt must have known about the impending attack, and his failure to do anything to ward it off was nothing less than treasonous. This concerned General Marshall very much because the code was still being used by the Japanese. He dispatched a colonel to the Dewey camp to try to persuade the governor to drop that campaign issue. Dewey was very suspicious. He knew that in FDR he faced a very tough and cunning opponent. And he also brought up this matter that the U.S. naval victory at the Battle of Midway was trumpeted in the Chicago Tribune with a headline along these lines: Midway victory, Americans knew Jap war plans, which could only have meant that we were breaking the Japanese code. He, however, was at heart a patriot, and he was ultimately persuaded that American victories and American lives depended on continuing to break that code, and he didn't raise it as a campaign issue. I might mention that Dewey lost the election. Now, was there something to Dewey's charge? The argument has been raised often by revisionist historians that Roosevelt did have prior knowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, how would that have come about? Well, it would have come about, as I mentioned, through the fact that the United States was breaking the Japanese diplomatic code. So let's see how that would have had to unfold. That would mean that the code breakers, who were Army enlisted men and Navy enlisted men, would now know that their country was about to be attacked by the Japanese. They would pass this information up to their senior officers in the Army and Navy, and now the nation's military leadership would know that the country was about to be attacked by the Japanese. These military officers, in turn, would pass this information up to the nation's leadership: the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, and the President himself. Now we have to imagine a giant conspiracy in which all of these people, from the President down through his cabinet, down through senior military officers, down to enlisted men, collude to conceal an attack that is going to cost the lives of over 2,400 Americans and a virtual destruction of our Pacific fleet. Why would they have done such a thing? Well, we are told by revisionist historians to get the United States into the war. But which war? Franklin Roosevelt was indeed eager to have the United States enter the war in Europe alongside Great Britain against Nazism. But he had confided to Winston Churchill that he considered a war against the Japanese as the wrong war in the wrong ocean at the wrong time. And in order for the United States to enter the war against Nazi Germany, there is a fact that is frequently overlooked, that it was Hitler who declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor. So viewed through the lens of logic, one can only fairly conclude, in my judgment, that the attack on Pearl Harbor was not a conspiracy, it was a catastrophe. Now, still in all, then we did have a great deal of information. We were breaking Japanese codes that were cabled from Tokyo to the various Japanese embassies around the world and to the Japanese embassy in Washington. We missed the threat of the attack. On September 11th of last fall, the United States was spending virtually billions of dollars through the National Security Agency to intercept and eavesdrop on messages all over the world. We missed that threat. Why? Well, after the fact, these strands of intelligence that lead from A to B to C to the Pearl Harbor stand out glaringly. But the same thing would be true of the strand of intelligence that led from X to Y to Z, perhaps to the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, will stand out glaringly. But they don't stand out glaringly before the fact. They don't stand out singly. They come in great bundles, twisted bundles of strands of intelligence. And the bundle contains information that is true, information that is untrue, information that is intelligently analyzed, information that is unintelligently analyzed, information that is relevant, information that is irrelevant, information that is deliberately distorted as disinformation to lead us astray. And then there is another problem along with this flood of intelligence, this overflow of intelligence that we intercept today. And it is this. There are a number of agencies involved in the intelligence business. You have the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, and a number of other peripheral agencies, all involved in this game. You would think presumably they would all be working together very closely to protect the same people in the same country. But intelligence is knowledge, and knowledge is power. And power distributed with rivals is seen as power diluted. I'm going to mention very briefly my work on Bill Casey, who was perhaps the most controversial CIA director we've had thus far. I did a biography of Casey a few years ago. Interestingly, one of his first targets was Afghanistan. Why? Because the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan at about the time most of our Dartmouth undergraduates were being born, around 1981 this was. It was a simpler world in some degree at that point because the world was divided not so much into black and white, but into red and white. And we were going to support regimes that opposed the communists, and the communists were going to support regimes that shared their philosophy. And at the time in Afghanistan, there was a pro-communist regime. None of the parties that were involved in Afghanistan were entirely with clean hands at that point. And during the Cold War, there was a pattern that went along something like this. That group may be a bunch of SOBs, but are they their SOBs or are they our SOBs? So we supported the anti-communist elements in Afghanistan. We poured sophisticated weapons into that country so that you arrive at a point where some nearsighted, illiterate Afghan peasant could hoist a Stinger missile to his shoulder and shoot down several $1 million worth of Soviet aircraft. Among the people we armed in this proxy struggle against the communist regime, there were people who subsequently became extremists, who turned against the United States, including some people who were members of the Taliban. Now we're hearing again after September 11th, though, that the United States and its intelligence activities cannot proceed like the Boy Scouts of America. We have to sometimes deal with some very unsavory people. This is something we have to do very carefully because We cannot assume that everybody who was in our corner and recently toppling essentially the Taliban regime is peopled by figures who are patterning their lives on Thomas Jefferson. We can't, for example, assume that every force that's against Saddam Hussein is determined to plant a Switzerland in the Middle East. When we deal with these people, we have to be very concerned about the unintended consequence of our alliances with them. Let me get back to Roosevelt's secret war now. I mentioned that Adolf Hitler had declared war on the United States shortly after Pearl Harbor. Historians have studied for decades why he would have taken what seemed to be a rather rash and reckless move. The reason I find is related to another breach of intelligence. In the fall of 1944, prior to Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt had asked his military people to prepare a contingency plan in the event the United States had to go to war against Germany by 1943. How many divisions would be required, how many ships, how many aircraft, how many tanks, etc. This contingency plan was dubbed Rainbow 5. Only 35 copies were permitted, and it was top secret. Somehow, one of these was leaked to the Chicago Tribune, which was Roosevelt's journalistic nemesis. The Tribune front-paged this story, but not as a contingency plan, but as a war plan. The headline read something like this: FDR, war against Germany by 1943. Well, obviously, a front-page story in an American newspaper was going to be available to the German leadership as well. And when Hitler declared war on the United States, he virtually quoted from the Chicago Tribune story, so that in doing so, he was not doing something that seemed to him to be rash or reckless, but rather anticipating the inevitable and getting the jump on the Americans. Prior to 1941, right through the 30s, the United States was the only major nation that lacked a professional intelligence service. At that point, Roosevelt depended very heavily on a circle of his socialite friends. A group of these people styled themselves as the Club. The Club maintained a shabby apartment on the Upper East Side. They had an unlisted telephone number. They had a secret mail drop. It was as though you had grown men playing the spy games of boys, except that these people were very well placed in American society. The leader of the Club was Vincent Astor, one of the richest men in the country. Astor was a director of the Western Union Telegraph Company. Consequently, he had access to telegraphic transmissions from foreign embassies in the United States back to their capitals, had these transmissions eavesdropped upon and reported what he learned to Roosevelt, although this was illegal at the time. Another member of the Club was Winthrop Aldrich. Winthrop Aldrich was then head of the Chase Manhattan Bank, and Aldrich then was privy to the international transactions that came through his bank. As a consequence, he knew exactly how much money was coming into and going out of the Russian spy front in the United States, the Amtorg Trading Company. This penchant for spy thriller, behind-the-scenes daring-do had exhibited itself very early in the life of Franklin Roosevelt. While a student at Harvard, he had developed his own code. He had numerals representing vowels, asterisks representing consonants, and everything was strung together as if one long word. It would have been child's play for a cryptologist, but it served Roosevelt's purpose as well, which was to keep his diary in code. One of his coded diary entries read, "Alice went to see her doctor today." The next coded entry read the following day, "Worried about Alice all night." We still don't know exactly what was the subject of his concern over Alice, but Roosevelt enjoyed very much this kind of clandestine covert behavior, even in the most personal matters. Finally, he arrives at the White House and he brings this penchant for secrecy along with him. And as Dr. Scher mentioned, quoting from my book, Roosevelt was better suited by character and temperament than any American president for secret warfare. He was a master manipulator of people. He would dissemble and deceive his own staff when it served his purposes. At times he seemed to enjoy subterfuge just for subterfuge's sake, even when unnecessary. And as Dr. Scher properly quoted Franklin Roosevelt, he said it best himself: "I never let my left hand know what my right hand is doing. I'm a juggler." One of the ideas that appealed to him very much occurred prior to Pearl Harbor, about a year or so before. Roosevelt was incensed at the war that the Japanese were conducting against China. And Chinese cities were suffering. Chinese civilians were being machine gunned from the air in the streets. Roosevelt wanted to give China the opportunity to retaliate against Japan. The idea considered was that the United States would give bombers to the Chinese, train Chinese pilots to fly these planes in raids against Tokyo and other Japanese cities. He was advised against this, the reasoning being that it would be too impractical and take too long to prepare these pilots to fly American aircraft. So the plan was scaled back so that we would still give the Chinese American bombers. We would have American pilots resign from the Army Air Corps and volunteer to fly these planes. But cooler heads prevailed, and the president was persuaded that having American bombers flown by American pilots against Japan would be an outright provocation and would lead to full-scale warfare. The plan was then scaled back another step, in which we gave the Chinese simply fighter aircraft, which were flown by American volunteer pilots. And this is the origin of that World War II legend, the Flying Tigers. Finally, in the summer of 1941, Roosevelt created America's first intelligence service, which ultimately came to be called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And to head it, he chose William Wild Bill Donovan. Donovan had been a authentic World War I hero, subsequently a vastly successful, wealthy Wall Street lawyer, still a rather odd choice because Donovan was a staunch Republican. He had run for governor of New York State on an anti-New Deal platform. Still, Donovan had an irrepressible optimism, endless energy, and bold imagination. And in these qualities, he essentially mirrored Franklin Roosevelt, who was happy to name him to what amounted to America's first Central Intelligence Agency. Donovan was a magnet for attracting people. He attracted into the OSS college professors, journalists, linguists, safecrackers, forgers, geographers, and it was a very impressive faculty that he gathered in America's first espionage service. He was also, though, because of this wild imagination of his, drawn to rather harebrained schemes, one of which was that American bombers would drop bombs into Japanese volcanoes, thereby causing them to erupt and create havoc in the enemy's homeland. Another of his ideas was that somehow OSS agents would intrude into Hitler's diet substances which would cause his breast to swell, his voice to rise, and his mustache to fall out. How this was to be achieved was never figured out. But Roosevelt did have a very sophisticated source of intelligence. It's one I touched on briefly, and that was the program known as MAGIC, whereby we were breaking the Japanese diplomatic code. At one point, Secretary of War Stimson burst into FDR's bedroom and said, "You've got to start paying more attention to the intercepts we're getting through MAGIC. You're just not giving them the importance that they deserve." Roosevelt was so attracted by these spy thriller, behind-the-scenes, secret agent kinds of operations that he was ignoring what is known in the jargon as signals intelligence, which is essentially code breaking. Stimson explained to him that by breaking the diplomatic code of the Japanese, we're not learning only about Japanese intentions, but we were also able to learn a great deal about Germany's intentions. And here's how that came about. The Japanese had an ambassador assigned to Berlin by the name of General Oshima. Oshima was a rabid pro-Nazi. Consequently, he became a confidant of Adolf Hitler's. Hitler would invite Ambassador Oshima in, and he would say, as he did on one occasion, "I'm going to send you to France to examine, to inspect the Atlantic Wall. These are my defenses for repelling an invasion by the Allies of the continent." Oshima would go, he would inspect the Atlantic Wall, and then he would come back and he would do what a good diplomat does. He would cable back to Tokyo whatever he had learned, whatever he had seen. We're breaking the Japanese diplomatic code, and now the Allies know essentially the nature of the Atlantic Wall and the defenses they will have to breach if they're going to have a successful invasion of France. On another occasion, Hitler invites Oshima in and says, "I'm going to tell you how I've deployed troops to stop this invasion. I'm going to have so many divisions in Norway, so many in Denmark, so many in Holland, Belgium," and most importantly tells him how he's going to array his divisions in France. And he says, "And I don't want you to breathe a word of this to anyone." Oshima goes back to his office, cables to Tokyo, "What have you seen?" And the Allies now know the strength of the forces they're going to face. Most critically, Hitler takes Oshima into his confidence and tells him, "I know where the invasion is going to strike. It will be at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel." Well, when we get the decrypt of that conversation, it's marvelous information, because this is exactly what the Allies wanted the Germans to believe. They were carrying out a deception plan designed to lead the Germans to conclude that the invasion would take place at the Pas de Calais, and thus where we intended to strike at Normandy would not be so heavily defended. One other thing that Oshima learned from Hitler was the Nazi timetable for the use of V1 and V2 super weapons. As a result of a secret effort to counteract these V1 and V2s, President Roosevelt made a decision which led inadvertently to the death of Joe Kennedy Jr., the elder brother of the future president. It came about in this way. The United States military had developed a secret operation whereby an aircraft would be loaded with high explosives. Pilot and co-pilot would take off and head towards one of these V1 or V2 launch sites. They would bail out, be picked up in the English Channel. In the meantime, the aircraft would be controlled by another plane through radio remote control and would be directed onto the target. Churchill was opposed to this scheme, feeling that if the Allies did this, that the Germans would retaliate against London. And Roosevelt argued rightly, as soon as they perfect these secret weapons, they're going to go against London. And so the program went forward, and one of the volunteers was Joe Kennedy Jr. for a mission known as Aphrodite. Kennedy and his co-pilot took off in this plane crammed with high explosives. They were not in the air for more than 20 minutes when the plane exploded in a ball of fire and both men were killed. Some months later, during the 1944 election campaign between Roosevelt and Dewey, Joe Kennedy Sr., the young pilot's father, who had been Roosevelt's ambassador to Great Britain, saw Harry Truman in Boston, where Truman was raising funds as Roosevelt's running mate. Truman, then a senator, is running now as vice president. And he is accosted by Joe Kennedy Sr., who says, "Harry, what are you doing working for that crippled son of a bitch who killed my son Joe?" The Germans had nothing comparable as a source of intelligence in the United States as we had through General Oshima's leaks. But there was one pipeline that ran virtually into the Oval Office from a highly unlikely source. The vice president in the early war years was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace had a brother-in-law of whom he was very fond by the name of Charles Brugman. The two men talked almost daily, and Wallace confided almost everything he knew of what was going on inside the Roosevelt administration. Charles Brugman happened to be the Swiss minister to the United States in Washington. And Brugman did what a good diplomat does. Whatever he learned from Henry Wallace, he cabled back to the Swiss Foreign Office in Bern. Unknown to Brugman, unknown to the Foreign Office, the Nazis had a plant in that office who eagerly awaited these reports from Brugman and then would pass them along to Berlin. And consequently, it was only a matter of days after Pearl Harbor that Adolf Hitler knew what went on in the White House on December 7th, 1941. He knows of the president's outrage, and more importantly, learns Roosevelt's inventory of the losses in ships, in planes, and in men. This leak continues until, well into 1944, when Wallace is finally dropped from the ticket and is replaced by Truman as vice president. Roosevelt, as I mentioned, had to be practically dragged kicking and screaming to appreciate the benefits of cryptology. Winston Churchill was just the opposite. Churchill would practically snatch this red lacquered box with decrypts from his code breakers from the hands of his courier. The British had managed to crack a seemingly unbreakable German code performed on the Enigma machine in a program known as Ultra, highly successful. After the war, a story was written that Churchill was so eager to protect the Ultra secret that upon learning through one of these intercepts that the city of Coventry was going to be bombed, did nothing to warn the city so that the Germans wouldn't know that their code was being broken. This story was subsequently debunked. But in the course of my research, I came across at the National Archives an authentic incident of how far Churchill intended to go to protect the ultra secret. A message was brought to him, an intercepted German message had been decoded, sent from the German military to Berlin, in which an accidental attack by an American aircraft on a plane, on a train, on a troop train, filled with British POWs, struck by the American aircraft accidentally with enormous loss of life. It was a horrendous situation. The American bombers had used delayed action bombs so that the Germans didn't even dare go in to try to rescue any of these people. As a consequence, over 500 British soldiers were killed by our fire. Churchill sends Roosevelt a message classified most secret, in which he says, in effect, no hard feelings, fortunes of war. The main thing is that we intend to say nothing about this disaster, and we will expect you to be equally quiet. This was to protect the ultra code-breaking operation. I came upon this in the National Archives that had never been published or investigated before, with over half a century having passed since this incident. Now, not all of the intelligence operations during the war were of the highest strategic level. In 1918, Franklin Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had been involved with a beautiful young woman named Lucy Mercer. Eleanor Roosevelt, upon learning this, threatened divorce, and Roosevelt promised that he would never, ever again see Lucy Mercer. Beginning in 1941, the White House Usher's Log records visits by a Mrs. Paul Johnson, which always take place when Eleanor Roosevelt is out of town. On one occasion, Roosevelt summons to the White House the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and says, I have it on very reliable authority that there is some suspicious construction going on in New Jersey, and around the construction site are being heard some very suspicious accents, and this is an area where at one point there had been a German-American organization. Hoover, always eager to please FDR, sends one of his best people up to New Jersey to investigate. The investigator finds out that the suspicious construction is a culvert that is being built to drain a farm field. The suspicious accents are being heard from an Italian worker who barely speaks any English, and the German-American organization has long since been defunct. More interestingly, he learns who was Roosevelt's reliable source for this story. And it is Lucy Mercer, now Lucy Mercer Rutherford. The agent reports this back to Hoover. Now, Hoover was notorious for the pleasure he took in amassing dossiers on the hanky-pank and hijinks of high-level people in the administration. And he now has a delicious tidbit for the Franklin Roosevelt file, and that is that the President of the United States has taken up again with his former mistress. The British, prior to the war, had been very eager for us to come in on their side. This is one of the principal policy objectives of Winston Churchill. To this end, Churchill had charged British intelligence with undertaking efforts that would lead the United States in that direction. Consequently, FDR was fed by the British a purloined map which showed how the Nazis intended to take over Latin America and divide it into 5 vassal states. They also provided him with a report stolen from a diplomatic pouch, which would indicate that the Nazis intended to overthrow a pro-American government in Bolivia. And they provided him with intelligence that the Germans already had 5,000 troops in Brazil who could ultimately threaten the Panama Canal. Now, Roosevelt used this information in his speeches and in his fireside chats. It was all fiction. It was all fabricated by British intelligence. Does this mean that Franklin Roosevelt was gullible and naive? These are 2 adjectives that I don't believe were ever applied to Franklin Roosevelt. However, he was eager to have the United States enter the war alongside the British, and he was not about to scrutinize to death any intelligence that would help him lead the American public in that direction. So we had the British feeding us false information, and we had our other ally, the Soviet Union, spying on us with great success. As is widely known, the Soviets were able to steal the critical secrets of the atom bomb from under the noses of the Manhattan Project. How this came about is a rather curious tale. At the beginning of the war, the United States and Great Britain were full partners in the pursuit of an atomic weapon. But as time went on and the United States created the Manhattan Project and poured billions into it, American scientists wanted to exclude the British, principally for security reasons. The less people who knew what was going on at Los Alamos, the better. Churchill was incensed by this, and in one of his trips to the United States, he accused Roosevelt of reneging on a deal. Roosevelt was stung by this criticism and decided on a compromise. He would allow 30 British nuclear scientists to come to the United States, to go to Los Alamos and work on the Manhattan Project. Among these 30 scientists was a German-born British scientist by the name of Klaus Fuchs, who, as we know, stole critical secrets of the atom bomb and passed them along to his Soviet masters. He is able to do this because of a secret deal and an unwitting result by the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The Soviets had another very useful source, practically at the President's elbow. Lachlan Curry was one of Roosevelt's personal assistants, highly trusted. Roosevelt turned over to Lachlan Curry the administration of our military aid program to China. He placed him in charge of a mission that traveled to Switzerland to try to pressure the Swiss to stop dealing with Nazi Germany. But there was another side as well to Lachlan Curry. On one occasion, he interceded to protect the job of a suspected Soviet agent working in a critical American wartime industry. On another occasion, he warned this same person that American cryptologists were engaged in trying to break Soviet codes. Curry was the White House man tracking the development of the B-29 bomber. Somehow the Soviets learned about the B-29. He learned about a secret operation to develop a very effective high explosive known as RDX. Somehow the Soviets learned about RDX. After the war, Curry vigorously denied ever having been a communist or ever having been a spy. He behaved in the way that a number of people who were subsequently accused of spying for the Soviet Union had behaved. His reasoning was, the Soviets are our ally in this war. They are inflicting 80% of the casualties on the Nazis. They are taking 80% of the Allied casualties. Why would we have to hold anything from them? So that whether or not Lachlan Curry was a spy in the conventional technical definition of that word may be a quibble, but in him they certainly had a priceless espionage resource. In December of 1944, about the time of the Battle of the Bulge, Roosevelt received a rather alarming warning. This was a time when the Germans were launching V-1s and V-2 rockets against England. Roosevelt had a personal agent whom he had placed in Istanbul by the name of George Earle. George Earle was a wealthy, rather rambunctious playboy, and he was in Istanbul undercover as a military attaché. Istanbul was a hotbed of espionage for all sides at this point because it was a neutral country. Earle sent a warning to Roosevelt that along with the V-1s and the V-2s, the Germans were perfecting a weapon designated as the V-3, which is to be targeted against the United States. This is not as far-fetched as it seemed. Indeed, the key German rocket scientists, Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger, had been working for years on something they described variously as the American rocket or the New York rocket. German submarines were practicing launching rockets from their deck, the idea being that they would surface off the American coast, maybe 250 miles off of New York, and lob rockets into the city. A German experimental 6-engine bomber had flown within 12 miles of New York. So Roosevelt took this threat seriously and had the American East Coast put on alert. At that point, we were luckier than we were last fall. Not that the Germans lacked the technical proficiency to perfect these weapons. They had it. But time simply ran out for the Third Reich, and these ideas died on the drawing board or in the blueprint stage. Now, what themes and threads run through the history of Roosevelt and intelligence in World War II? The principal outcome of his activity was that Roosevelt wove into the fabric of American international behavior, American foreign policy for the first time, the element of intelligence. When he created the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, he in effect created America's first Central Intelligence Agency, and all evidence was that he intended to continue it into the peacetime era. However, Roosevelt dies. Harry Truman becomes president. Truman had never liked the OSS. Harry Truman was a plain-spoken, straight shooter, and the way he put it, the United States had no need for a Gestapo. So the war in the Pacific was barely over a few weeks when, with a dismissive thank you, he dissolved the OSS. The Cold War begins, and as it gets colder, Truman realizes that the United States has to have an intelligence capability, and in effect, he refloats the OSS as the CIA. Now, obviously, wars are not won by cracking the enemy ambassador's safe. They are not won by people who develop invisible inks. They're not developed by mathematicians who break codes. Wars are won by combatants on the ground, seizing territory, by aircraft bombing enemy targets, by our ships sinking their ships. But the success in these endeavors is markedly affected by the quality of intelligence operations. Franklin Roosevelt brought to this aspect of the war the same qualities that pervaded all his life as domestic policies as well. And that is, he could be very devious in the pursuit of desirable goals. He could be maddeningly inconstant in pursuing constant objectives. He was rather like a warship hidden behind a smokescreen, which was nevertheless steered by a moral compass. He led the United States to victory in World War II, a war in which our intelligence operations played a significant role. And he did so with a talent for intrigue that sprang from his very character. Thank you all for coming.
Mr. Persico will be happy to answer a few questions. I would note once again that this lecture is being taped by C-SPAN. So once you've been recognized, please wait until a microphone has been handed to you before you ask your question.
Young man in the first row, will just hold on a second until you get a mic.
Hi. I was just wondering what you thought of the extraordinary circumstances that allowed a hippie from California to infiltrate the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and potentially, why couldn't the United States and the whole bureaucratic operations of the CIA, the FBI, not produce somebody like John Walker as an informant And you described in this history the sort of creativity and imagination that existed in many intelligence operations. Has that imagination and creativity decreased over the years, and is that a product of the bureaucratic nature of intelligence operations today?
Well, as far as our planting a character like Lind among our adversaries, I'm quite convinced we have, but it would be a danger to their health if we were to talk about that. As far as Lind, I'm afraid my thinking is a little outside of the box. I'm convinced that any group of more than 1,000 people is going to have its crackpots. And the media attention that's focused on this man is because he's a single person now. I don't think he's all that significant. I don't think he's revealing of a malaise in the American character. As far as the latter part of your question, are we more imaginative now? Well, we do a lot more because we spend billions. How much better the imagination is, I don't know. Yes, sir, with the gray sweater.
In your judgment, why did Nelson Rockefeller never become president?
Well, I wrote a biography of Nelson Rockefeller after having worked with him for 11 years. And I'm going to relate a story I tell in that book. I think Rockefeller could have been elected president, except that he could never get the Republican nomination. He was a very powerful, attractive, magnetic, accomplished figure. At one time, he was touring South America during his period as governor of New York. And he was in Buenos Aires. And he had a team along with him, of which I was a member. And one of the Argentine reporters at a press conference said to him, "Senor Rockefeller, why is it that you were never president of the United States?" And from the safe distance of something like 6,000 miles, he said, "I was in the wrong party." Yes, sir, with the beard. On your left-hand side. There we go.
I wonder if you would tell us something about William Stevenson and the British Intrepid operation in New York.
Well, William Stevens was a Canadian millionaire, World War I hero, who came to the United States, and his job principally was to carry on activities that would lead the United States into the war. This was the assignment handed him by Churchill, and to see that we stayed firm allies throughout the war. It bears on the story that I discussed in my speech of the phony information that was concocted by British intelligence and passed along to the president, and this happened on the watch of William Stevenson, whom you mentioned. Yes, sir.
In July of '41, Roosevelt initiated the oil embargo on Japan along with the Dutch and the British. Do you believe that he understood that that would be the straw that would break the back to eventually lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor?
In my remarks, I mentioned that Roosevelt had considered a plan for using American aircraft to bomb Japan. He indeed instituted this embargo, which in effect would have frustrated the Japanese master plan, which was to create what they call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which meant that they would have influence throughout practically all of the Western Pacific. Did Roosevelt know that this would lead to the Japanese attack? I think he was hoping to go as far as he could without going to war to stem the Japanese aggression. As I mentioned again in my remarks, he didn't want that war in the Pacific against the Japanese. But certainly in the Japanese calculations, this figures very importantly. Yes, sir.
What about how intelligent is and especially interested in Owen Lattimore. Do you think they were spies?
I think that as a result of something that's come to the fore very recently, which is known as Venona. Venona is the code-breaking operation that the United States carried out from towards the end of the war up until very recently. During the war, we started intercepting Soviet transmissions from presumably Soviet agents in the United States back to Moscow. For a long time, we were piling these messages up, but we didn't know how to break them. This program known as Venona finally cracked these codes. And I would say the balance of evidence of this code-breaking operation, in which Alger Hiss is mentioned by code names fairly often, makes fairly clear that he was probably in the service of the Soviet Union. Owen Lattimore, I don't think so. And I don't know enough about it to go into any deeper detail. Any other questions? Way back.
Well, considering how the media covers scandals today, it's absolutely remarkable that they never unearthed Lucy Mercer. I was in the White House map room the last 2 years of the war, and even we did not really know what was going on there until shortly before the president died.
Well, I don't think that's all bad. My own perception is that I would like to judge our leaders on how they lead the country and not focus so much on their personal lives. We had a bit more civil press corps in that era. For example, when Roosevelt died towards the end of the war, I was 15 years old and had never a glimmer of knowledge that he was paralyzed. And I think that this was a respect shown to him by the media, which has completely evaporated today. Yes, sir.
Why was Roosevelt so insistent in his demand for unconditional surrender with the Germans? Now, he surprised Roosevelt when they, Churchill when they were in Casablanca, and both Churchill and Stalin recommended to Roosevelt that they could end the war in 1943 if they would just back off on conditional surrender, because not only were they, the SIS, the British, and the Soviets were working with some captured Germans, but there was a movement in Germany to have a coup d'etat with Hitler, and I believe that was headed up by Admiral Canaris. And Canaris was dealing with Allen Dulles, I believe, and
the question
as well
is
as the SIS.
Why Roosevelt pressed for unconditional surrender, which he did. And it did come as a surprise to Churchill and to Stalin. First of all, my own conviction is that it's unlikely that Hitler would have carried out any kind of negotiations along these lines. We saw an Armageddon in Germany. He went down with the swastika flying, with the rubble bouncing in Berlin. Furthermore, there was an attempt on Hitler's life, which shows that the resistance to Hitler and the opposition was not all that deep. It was a resistance movement that was completely crushed. Finally, while unconditional surrender has been debated since the war as to whether it was a wise move, I think Roosevelt was at heart deeply idealistic and not quite as practical or pragmatic, I should say, as certainly Stalin and to some extent Winston Churchill. And I think he felt that the United States was, in a sense, engaged in a crusade. And you couldn't ask American families, American mothers, American wives, American children to give up the lives of their sons, their husbands, their fathers, for some kind of negotiated peace that might leave the world as it was prior to the war. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering about two things. What was the relationship between the FBI and the OSS? And what was the relationship between Nelson Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger?
Tall order. The relationship between the OSS and the FBI was pretty much as I indicated in my speech as one of the causes why we don't handle intelligence well. They were rivals. J. Edgar Hoover couldn't stand Wild Bill Donovan, and Wild Bill Donovan didn't trust Edgar Hoover. As far as Nelson Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger was plucked from the faculty at Harvard to be Rockefeller's foreign policy advisor through Rockefeller's unsuccessful attempts to be nominated as Republican candidate for president. That's how he came to the fore, and the rest is history. I'll take one more question.
Do you sense that in the at the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington that they are trying to downplay Pearl Harbor and the warnings about Pearl Harbor?
That's a very good question. I visited the relatively new FDR Memorial by the tidal basin in Washington. It's very impressive. However, I was astonished by one discovery. There is nowhere in that monument to FDR, who led us to victory in World War II, no reference whatever to something that is known to even the most benighted college sophomore, and that is his remarks, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy. There's no mention of it in the FDR memorial. And I'm just curious, as something of a rudimentary poll, how many people in our audience today are surprised or disappointed to learn that there is no mention of this most memorable and rallying and rousing phrase coming out of the World War II? Well, I would say it's near unanimous. I'm not sure why. I mean, perhaps it's some kind of international political correctness or some fear of Yamaha dealers. Anyway, on that note, I thank all of you for coming. I've had a very stimulating afternoon.
Thank you. I think you did, yeah. Okay, yeah. I think you do have it. I remember about that name that
A faculty advisor, he had tea with the president of the college, which I consider probably one of the pioneer programs in America of the Head Start program. Ever since my book, Roosevelt's Secret War, was published last fall, I've been asked repeatedly about the parallels between December 7th, 1941 and September 11th, 2001. My general observation is that while techniques and technologies change, the historical forces remain surprisingly similar, and our reactions to these forces, which I think will be borne out by some of my remarks today. In September of 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented fourth term against the Republican candidate Thomas E. Dewey, then governor of New York State. The chief of staff of the Army at that time was General George Marshall. Marshall was very concerned to learn that Dewey intended to raise as a political issue the attack on Pearl Harbor. Dewey's reasoning was as follows. Everybody knew that the United States was breaking the Japanese diplomatic code through a code-breaking operation known as MAGIC. Therefore, Roosevelt must have known about the impending attack, and his failure to do anything to ward it off was nothing less than true.
With Joseph Persico. He's the author of Roosevelt's Secret War, a book about President Roosevelt and World War II espionage. He spoke at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire earlier this week, and he took questions from the students. This event is just over an hour.
Good afternoon. My name is Barry Scher, and I'm the provost at Dartmouth College. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the fourth of 6 lectures in the Montgomery Endowment series entitled Intelligence, the Need to Know. This series is designed to bring an array of experts to the Dartmouth community to examine intelligence issues which were brought to the nation's keen attention by the tragic events of September 11th. The lectures will continue to be offered each Tuesday here in Filene Auditorium through September 26th, and as always, they'll be at 4 p.m. This series is made possible through the generosity of Kenneth Montgomery, class of 1925, and his wife, Harl, who created and funded the endowment in 1978 so that Dartmouth could bring outstanding individuals to campus to meet with our students and faculty. And as I've done at least once before on this occasion, I'd like to again thank Barbara Gersten, who's done so much to arrange not only this lecture and the entire series, but other events throughout the history of the Montgomery Endowment. We have heard from Mark Grecht, former officer in the CIA, James Woolsey, former director of Central Intelligence, and David Weiss, author of Bureau and the Mole, which gave us insights into the workings and a major blunder by the FBI. Today's speaker is Joseph Persico, who will give us a more historical view of the United States intelligence activities. In 1956, he began his political writing career, serving Governor Averell Harriman of New York as a writer and researcher, after which he served as a Foreign Service officer for the U.S. Information Agency. By 1966, he became the chief speechwriter for New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Continuing this position for another 7 years, he remained Rockefeller's primary speechwriter as the governor assumed the office of the Vice Presidency of the United States from 1975 to 1977. In 1977, Joseph Persico transitioned into a full-time author, focusing on historical subjects. He wrote on the Civil War in a book entitled My Enemy, My Brother, Men and Days of Gettysburg, and followed that with a novel, The Spiderweb, and a nonfiction study, Piercing the Reich, the penetration of Nazi Germany by American secret agents during World War II. In 1982, Persico focused on Nelson Rockefeller's life and published the biography, The Imperial Rockefeller. During the 90s, the author created other historical works on both American espionage and the Nuremberg war crimes trials following World War II. These works included Casey, from the OSS to the CIA, and Nuremberg, Infamy on Trial. Persico also chose renowned broadcast journalist Edward R. Murrow for a biographical sketch in 1990. He has collaborated with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of State, Colin L. Powell, on the latter's biography. Last year, Random House Incorporated released Roosevelt's Secret War, FDR and World War II Espionage, which is the title of his talk today. In his book, Mr. Persico wrote, "Few leaders have been better suited by nature and temperament for the anomalies of secret war than FDR." And to quote FDR, "You know, I am a juggler and I never let my right hand know what my left hand does," he once confessed. "I may be entirely inconsistent, and furthermore, I am perfectly willing to mislead and tell untruths if it will help me win this war." Mr. Persico goes on to comment that Roosevelt's style of leadership bears out this admission. His behavior, which fascinated, puzzled, amazed, dismayed, and occasionally repelled people, parallels many of the qualities of an espionage chief. Let us now hear more about Roosevelt, the man who created America's first intelligence agency, the SOS, by welcoming Joseph Persico.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Dr. Scher. Dr. Scher mentioned that I spent part of my checkered past writing speeches for Nelson Rockefeller, who was a Dartmouth alum, class of 1930. My most vivid recollection of his years here was from the very beginning. He arrived here as an 18-year-old in 1926. And the first thing he did was call upon Dr. Hopkins, so that before ever having met a fellow classmate, a fellow roommate, business. This concerned General Marshall very much because the code was still being used by the Japanese. He dispatched a colonel to the Dewey camp to try to persuade the governor to drop that campaign issue. Dewey was very suspicious. He knew that in FDR he faced a very tough and cunning opponent. And he also brought up this matter that the U.S. naval victory at the Battle of Midway was trumpeted in the Chicago Tribune with a headline along these lines: Midway victory, Americans knew Jap war plans, which could only have meant that we were breaking the Japanese code. He, however, was at heart a patriot, and he was ultimately persuaded that American victories and American lives depended on continuing to break that code, and he didn't raise it as a campaign issue. I might mention that Dewey lost the election. Now, was there something to Dewey's charge? The argument has been raised often by revisionist historians that Roosevelt did have prior knowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, how would that have come about? Well, it would have come about, as I mentioned, through the fact that the United States was breaking the Japanese diplomatic code. So let's see how that would have had to unfold. That would mean that the code breakers, who were Army enlisted men and Navy enlisted men, would now know